How many ancient civilizations can you think of? We're going to talk about 8 of them today, and we'll remember the wonderful things they left behind. These civilizations may be gone now, but they're not forgotten. Welcome to
Aprender Inglés con Reza y Craig.
Hello, and if you're a new listener to our podcast, you are very, very welcome. And if you've come back to listen again this week, thank you very much. My name's Craig.
And my name is Reza.
And together with 50 years of teaching English between us, Reza and I are going to help you improve your English and take it to the next level. How are you, mate?
I'm doing very well, I must say. I'm now into the swing of the second term. I've had my Christmas and New Year break, and it's back to work. But that's fine. How are you?
Back to the grind. Yes, I'm fine. Always a pleasure to get together with you and do a podcast or two. Oh, it rhymes. I'm a poet and I didn't know it. First this week we have a voice message from Omar from Mexico.
Hello, Craig. Hello, Reza. Hope you both are doing well. I'm calling from Mexico, a little municipality near to the city of Mexico called Texcoco. Yeah, it's maybe a little difficult, the pronunciation, but here's where I live. I just want you to congratulate you both for this really marvelous work you do. So the ones that are learning English help a lot. And I also want to say that why don't you speak about the Aztecs or ancient people who lived here in Mexico? Maybe it's a topic that you could considerate. I also want to tell you that I've been listening your podcasts. Maybe there are 100 left, but I'm doing my best effort to listen to all of them. And well, that's all. I hope you are doing well. I continue doing this. I really like your podcast. Thank you very much. See you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much for your message, Omar. It was lovely to hear from you, and you have 100 more episodes to listen to. And we do like your idea of speaking about the Aztecs, but we are going to speak about other ancient civilizations as well. And I don't know if you've managed to listen to the episode we did on Mexico. You might be interested in listening to that if you haven't already. That was episode 298. So go to inglespodcast.com/298, Omar. And if you haven't listened to that, you'll hear about your country over there.
Yes, Omar, thanks very much for your message. It was really, really good to get it from you. I'd just like to make a few suggestions. I think you said that talking about the Aztecs is a topic that you could, and you said considerates, I think. But the real word is consider. Maybe you were thinking of the noun consideration, and you thought, oh, maybe the verb ends in ate, but it doesn't. In fact, the verb is to consider, and the noun is consideration. So yes, we should consider, and we have considered, talking about the Aztecs, and we're going to mention them along with the other civilizations.
And one more very small point, Omar. You said, I've been listening to your podcast. You do need the preposition to after listen. So it's better to say, I've been listening to your podcast. Now, last year, Reza, if you remember, we did have somebody offer to give us €100 if people remembered the two. Now, we went down and up. I don't think we got below €85 because we had to remove €5 every time somebody forgot that preposition. But then we went back up when people remembered it. And we finished the end of last year, 2022, with the €100, which was fantastic for everybody's grammar and also fantastic for us. So what would you like to do? Should we go out for a meal and celebrate that?
Or do you want to run it over into this year? What do you think?
I don't mind. If we run it over to this year, With a different grammar point or the same grammar point?
What about a different point? That's a good idea. What's another typical mistake that people do that we could look out for? Hold on. What's another typical mistake that people make, not do? Maybe make and do. Shall we do that? Yeah, that's a good one. I've just made the mistake because I didn't plan what I was going to say. Another typical mistake that people make, not do, is make and do. What about that every time somebody says make instead of do, or vice versa?
Okay, so make and do is our grammar point for 2023. Every time you make a mistake and you use the wrong collocation, like Reza just did with do, we are going to subtract €5 from our €100 pot, or kitty, we could say, amount of money. And every time somebody correctly uses it, we go up, but we cannot go above that €100. And if at the end of this year we still have all the money, we will spend it on a meal. So we are waiting for you to get your grammar correct. So make or do, be careful. And if you want to revise make and do so that you don't make those mistakes, just search make and do on inglespodcast.com and you'll find episodes with make and do collocations so that you can revise when we use make and when we use do.
Okay, Craig. Ancient civilizations. Let's do this.
Let's do it. The first one we're going to look at is the oldest civilization. That's the ancient Egyptian civilization. Now, we're going to use BC when we're speaking about how long these civilizations lasted, the duration. So BC is before Christ, and AD is after the birth of Christ. I think it's Latin, isn't it? AD, is it Anno Domini or something?
That's it.
Yeah. So AD after, it's easy to remember because B is before and A is after. So that's how you remember it.
So I'm sure you've all heard of the ancient Egyptians. I'd be surprised if you hadn't heard of them. Obviously, they were from ancient Egypt. That's why they're called the Egyptians. But specifically, they started off in the Nile Valley. So above all, they lived along the banks of the River Nile. From around 3150 BC right up to about 30 BC. So nearly to around about the time of the birth of Christ. Not long before that.
And what were they famous for? Well, you probably know they were famous for the building or construction of their pyramids, the wonderful pyramids of Egypt, and also for mummification, for mummies. Now, when I say mummies, I don't mean mothers. I mean the fact that when people died in ancient Egypt, they wrapped their bodies with bandages or cloth in order to preserve the body. So that's called mummification. Egyptian mummies. And of course, the pharaoh kings. The kings of Egypt were called pharaohs. And apart from those things, the ancient Egyptians also gave us very distinctive and beautiful art, pottery, paintings, etc., and a selection of gods, a collection of different gods that they worshipped, and obviously a very rich mythology.
Now, the earliest villages were agricultural, and they date way back to 7,000 years ago on the banks of the River Nile. Obviously, then, that makes the roots of the ancient Egyptian civilization one of the oldest known civilizations of all time.
They're also famous for the very first peace treaty. And the first peace treaty or peace agreement was signed between Pharaoh Ramses II and the Hittites. And this was at the end of a very long and bloody conflict or war that lasted for 200 years. And when I use the adjective bloody, that's describing the war as being full of blood, very violent, with many people dying. And that very first peace treaty was signed in 1274 BC.
Now, the ancient kingdom of the Egyptians, it slowly disappeared, and one of the reasons was one of their neighbors from not so far away, the ancient Assyrians, They weakened Egypt's military and economy. The word Assyrian isn't exactly very different from the word Syrian. So you can guess that their neighbors, the Assyrians, Assyrian, were another civilization not far away who lived in what would be modern-day Syria. And they were enemies, and they weakened them, and eventually they disappeared. And even their beautiful hieroglyphics, their beautiful alphabet made up of pictures, slowly disappeared. And then the equally beautiful Greek alphabet replaced hieroglyphics.
And those Egyptian kings, the pharaohs, they died out and they ended because of the Romans. So eventually they disappeared. And the Arabs took control of the country, or the dominion of Egypt, in 640 AD, so after Christ. And by the 16th century, which is a long time after, hundreds of years after, the Egyptian language had been completely replaced with Arabic in that area.
Let's move on to our next civilization. We've already mentioned them because they were around at the same time as the ancient Egyptians, but they came to dominance after them. We're talking, of course, about the ancient Greeks, whose civilization was around from about 2700 BC to about 479 BC. So again, they disappeared before the birth of Christ. So obviously, it started in Greece, but their influence, their civilization, their empire, you could say, extended into Italy, Sicily, North Africa, including into Egypt, and as far west as France.
And apart from having such a huge area of influence and domination, the Greeks gave us many, many things. They gave us democracy, they gave us art, philosophy, if you think of famous philosophers like Plato, Aristotle, Socrates. They gave us the basis for science and maths. Pythagoras, for example, if you've studied Pythagoras' theorems at school, Archimedes, the Archimedes screw comes to mind, all Greek mathematicians. Literature, they gave us astronomy, medicine. Famous Greek student of medicine, Hippocrates, gave us the birth of the Hippocratic Oath that doctors have to agree to when they become doctors. And obviously theatre with the poems of Homer. That's not Homer Simpson, although the spelling is the same. Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. What else did they give us, Reza?
If that weren't enough, they also give us the idea of having a senate. The Olympic Games, yes, from ancient Olympus. The Greeks were the first serious athletes. That started way back in 776 BC. In fact, to distinguish, we talk about the modern Olympic Games as compared to the ancient Olympic Games. So the ancient Greeks had their own Olympic Games. And basically, ancient Greece is often considered simply the cradle of Western civilization. It's where Western civilization, as we know and recognize it today, really comes from.
And it all started, it has very humble agricultural beginnings. It started with farmers during the time of what they call the Greek Dark Ages. In the very beginning, when there were only a few villages, the Greeks worked on the land, they grew some food. But when ancient Greece was at its peak means its pinnacle, its height, the top, P-E-A-K, the peak, around 700 BC, these small villages had grown and developed into huge city-states.
Because of all this growth, new land was needed, so Greece could spread into the 1,500, more or less, city-states from the Mediterranean all the way to Asia Minor. Asia Minor is what we consider as modern-day Turkey. And from the Black Sea right the way down south to North Africa.
So how did this incredible Greek empire fall and disappear? Well, their power didn't end with blood and fire and violence. There was no conquering opposing army that came in and defeated the Greeks. Instead, around 480 BC, the era became a spectacular classical age, which was a time that really changed dramatically the architectural and philosophical thinking right up until 323 BC.
Let's move over to another part of the world now. Let's go to what Europeans used to call the New World. But of course, it wasn't new at all for the Mayans. May have been new to the Europeans who got there, but they were by no means the first civilization to be there. The Mayans were around from about 2600 BC, right up till after Christ was born, so right up to 900 AD. And their sphere of influence, where they were important, would be the Yucatan Peninsula, Quintana Roo, Campeche. I'm sure a lot of you, like me, have heard of Tabasco because you love the famous sauce named after that place. Chiapas in Mexico, and also in other countries right through to Guatemala, Belize, El Salvador, and Honduras.
Now, the Mayans were in Central America for thousands of years, but it was around the year 1800 BC, so nearly 2,000 years before Christ. That's when people in the area who were before hunters and gatherers, a hunter and gatherer, that's how people used to live. They would move around from place to place. They would kill animals where they could find animals. They would eat some fruit and some berries and then move on to another place. Well, about 1800 BC, that's where they decided to settle down and stay in one place. To settle down is to be in permanent homes, and they could keep animals in their homes. They could grow food. So they changed from hunter-gatherers to farmers, really.
And they were very good at it. They were really successful farmers. And not only that, they were also good at architecture. They built very tall and impressive temples, some of them still standing today. And they had a very unusual calendar that counted in millions of years and a really incredible understanding of astronomy. They were very good at understanding the stars in the sky, and they kept very extensive records about all of these things.
So what happened at the end of this civilization? Well, there were a few reasons why the Mayans stopped to dominate the area. Inner conflict, which means they started to argue between themselves. There was a very bad drought at that time. That word drought, D-R-O-U-G-H-T, it's no water. So obviously if they were growing food and there was no rain, no water, a drought, then they couldn't eat because they didn't have enough food. And at the same time, more or less, the Spanish came. And we're going to hear this more later. The Spanish came over in the 16th century, and that led to their downfall. That word downfall is quite self-explanatory. You fall down, you collapse. So the noun downfall means the civilization collapsed.
So the Mayan culture mostly disappeared under the pressure from the Spanish to convert to Christianity. The Mayans had their own gods and religion until the Spanish arrived, but they forced them or tried to force them to become Christians. And also the spread of European diseases wasn't good either. There were certain diseases, illnesses, which didn't exist in the Americas until the Spanish brought them over, and so the immune system of the Mayans was not ready to cope with such diseases, so that killed a lot. But they never became completely extinct, because millions of their descendants actually still exist across the world today, and some of them even continue to speak some of the several languages which the Mayans spoke. So there wasn't just one Mayan language, there were actually several, and some of them have survived to this day.
So let's move from that area of the world. Let's go from what we call these days the Americas, Central America, South America. Let's go over to Asia and China, the ancient Chinese, and talk about the Chinese dynasties. Do you say dynasties or dynasties, Reza?
I say dynasties, but I think mostly in America they say dynasties, right?
Yeah, it's an American. Yeah, right. It's an American thing. Yeah, I say dynasty as well. The Chinese dynasty. The Chinese dynasty more or less lasted from 1600 BC up until 1046 BC. That's what we're going to focus on. And the area was around the Yellow River in China and the Yangtze region.
So they started off as small Neolithic villages, but they eventually became famous dynasties that first appeared along the north of the Yellow River.
And what do we remember them for? Well, they gave us many lovely things. They invented paper and silk, which we still use today, and the first compass, especially the maritime compass. A compass is something that will tell you when you're going north, south, east and west. Very, very useful for navigation, especially in those days when they were exploring different parts of the world by sea. They gave us the printing press and gunpowder, which is great for fireworks, but not so great for guns and explosives and killing people. But we did get gunpowder from the Chinese. They also invented and perfected porcelain making, lovely Chinese pottery and ceramics. And they did this 1,000 years, yes, 1,000 years before European craftsmen did.
Let's just point out that when we say that the ancient Chinese invented these things, indeed they did. But you'll notice that with a lot of these civilizations, they also invented the same thing, but without knowing that it had already been invented. So, for example, the Egyptians, they invented their own form of paper as well, which we call papyrus, but they didn't know that the Chinese were also inventing their own form of paper. So it's not like, I'm not saying that they copied each other, but it was the Chinese who we think now first invented paper. But let's not take credit away from the others who also invented things, but they didn't know. Like the Europeans who invented porcelain, they didn't know that the Chinese had already invented it. In fact, before them. So they invented it at different periods of time. And you'll notice that what do we call really good quality ceramic plates and cups and dishes? What do we call them in English?
China.
China.
Yep.
Because we recognized that their quality was much, much better. So the really good stuff is good quality China.
And what happened to the Chinese, the ancient Chinese empires? Eventually, infighting. They were fighting amongst themselves, the same as the Romans, actually, and we'll hear about that in a second. But that led to wars between themselves, and eventually that ended the final dynasty, the Chinese dynasty, which was the Shang dynasty, and that happened in 1046 BC.
One thing I'd just like to add about talking about the Chinese history of the dynasties, China may be the one exception in all of these where they're about to get a second chance. We're recording this podcast in 2023, and many people talk of a new Chinese empire, something like the ancient dynasties. It could be that the 21st century is the time when China becomes the new superpower. Who knows? Watch this space. It wouldn't surprise me. What do you think, Craig?
Well, what's interesting is that the things that they invented, they're using that to build their empire again, because we are buying paper and silk or clothes and porcelain and everything from China, but just a lot cheaper than we can buy it here. So they invented it and they're selling it back to us at a cheaper price.
Let's get back closer to home now for our next group of people who had a very important civilization. Who hasn't heard of the Romans? The Romans were around from about 753 BC. And of course, it was the Romans who were around whenever Jesus was born, in the year that would be technically 0, right to the other side to 476 AD, Anno Domini. So the Romans were around before the birth of Christ and then quite a while after as well.
Some say responsible for his death.
Well, some say, if the story is true, definitely responsible for his death. And of course, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to figure out that the ancient Roman Empire started in Rome and the Tiber River in Italy.
Although Rome wasn't always the impressive, fantastic metropolis and impressive city that it is these days, Rome's beginnings were very modest, a very modest village. That's how Rome started. And it started by people who settled on the banks of the Tiber River. And then that exploded and grew into one of the most powerful ancient empires in world history. And when I say it exploded, I don't mean like a bomb. I mean it exploded in numbers, and it diversed and expanded incredibly quickly.
But still, it took a while to become the huge empire that it eventually was, because Rome wasn't built in a day, you know.
No, it wasn't.
It wasn't. That's a very common thing we say in English. Rome wasn't built in a day is a way of saying great things take time to do, like the building of the Roman Empire.
Some people say, your podcast has a lot of listeners. I say, well, it wasn't built in a day. It took some years. Yeah.
So through war and trading, buying and selling, the Roman Empire reached a lot of places. Most of Northern Africa, Western Asia, continental Europe, even Britain, and the Mediterranean and all its islands, of course.
The culture, the Roman culture is very famous for, obviously, its monuments. Anyone who's been to Rome and in the area, you can see incredible monuments that still exist today. And this is thanks to special concrete that the Romans used to build their structures and their monuments. So concrete is the really hard stuff that you mix with water and you make buildings out of it. And the Romans perfected this, and that's why these buildings are still standing so many years later. They built the Colosseum, obviously, the Pantheon, and many, many more fantastic monuments.
Yes, in fact, a lot of cities, really, the original cities were built by the Romans. Here we are recording in a place called Valencia, but the Romans would have known it as Valentia. The name Valencia comes from the Roman Valentia, the brave city. Craig grew up in London, or a place that you might have called several thousand years ago Londinium. What major city in Europe wasn't founded by the Romans? Not many.
Was it Belfastinium? Was that one?
I'm glad you mentioned that. I'll tell you a little side note. That means I'm going off from topic a little bit. The Romans did know Ireland. We know this as an absolute fact because they had a word for it. Hibernia, the land of winter. And there's lots of theories as to why they didn't really conquer it. So they knew about Ireland. It's not very far away from England and Scotland.
Maybe the Irish were too tough, too difficult to fight.
That is the case of the Scots. They did conquer quite a lot of England, but they couldn't really beat the Scots, the famous Picts. The Scots at the time were too much for them. But most historians agree now they didn't really try to conquer Ireland because they couldn't be bothered. They didn't fancy it much. They were there.
Much there.
They didn't really like the sound of it. Hibernia, the land of winter, they thought, it's too cold here, it rains all the time. There's nothing to forget about this. I'm a Roman Italian bloke walking around in a skirt. I don't want to be living in this place. So they couldn't be bothered. They didn't really invade Ireland because they just didn't fancy it. Strange thought.
Well, it made more sense to focus on the Mediterranean area with the sunshine and the beaches. So I quite understand that. The Romans gave us many things. The Romans gave us our calendar that we use today from January to December. Currency, they gave us money that became very popular. And aqueducts for irrigation. So to grow food, you need to transport water from one place to another place. The Romans were experts at that. They also cleaned up cities by using sanitation. So all the waste water that spread disease, they managed to remove that from where people were living. And of course the roads, the famous Roman roads, so that you could transport not only food and other things, but importantly for the Romans, troops and weapons of war, so they could move their troops and conquer and take control of other areas thanks to their road system.
Where we're recording this podcast right now, I think is no more than about 2 kilometers away from the Via Augusta, which is now a very nice cycle lane, which will take you from Valencia north through Alboraya and El Puig and a few places, and through Tarragona and right up into Europe. The Via Augusta, we're about 2 kilometers from it here, and it still survives today, and it was made a few thousand years ago.
That's right. They also gave us a language, Latin, which is these days a dead language, but obviously it's the base for the language that we use, or many words come from Latin from many languages. The base of many languages is Latin. It's also the language of religion. And Romans gave us newspapers because back in the Roman Empire, news of the area was written on wax slabs. Wax is the material that candles are made of, and slab is just a big piece of it. So big pieces of wax, or papyri, which is kind of a reed or plant-based paper. News was written on these things and then displayed in the center of the village or town. So these daily acts, as they were called, the acta diurna, they originated back in 131 BC, the birth of the modern newspaper.
But like all empires, it had to come to an end. The Roman Empire was no different, and it crumbled due to, not surprisingly, political unrest, power struggles, and eventually ended up as a civil war. So basically, the empire had grown too large, and its borders couldn't be defended. They overstretched themselves. And the Germanic tribes, led by Odovacar, they defeated what remained of the Roman army, and they got rid of the last emperor, Romulus Augustus. And then they put their own man in as king of Italy, and that was the end of the Roman civilization in about 476 AD.
Moving on to our next civilization, another part of the world, the Persians. The Persian civilization lasted from 550 BC up to 331 BC, so before Christ. And the area was Egypt in the west to Turkey in the north, through Mesopotamia to the Indus River in the east. So these days, the area would be mostly in Iran and that kind of area of the Middle East.
A very famous Persian king was Cyrus II. Cyrus II is perhaps the best known of the Persian kings. Obviously, he wasn't the first. There was a Cyrus I, but he presided the empire perhaps when it was at its peak. The Persians, in fact, had the largest empire recorded in ancient history, not in modern history, but in those times. And not only did it include what would be Iran today, but also Egypt, Turkey, northern India, and what would be Pakistan today, Afghanistan, and a lot of parts of Central Asia.
And what did the Persians give us? Well, the Persian culture left us great ruins, intricate metalworks. They were very, very good at working with metal, and some fantastic golden treasures that have been found. And also the Persians practiced a religion called Zoroastrianism. And Zoroastrianism is one of the oldest religions that is still practiced today by people. Reza, what do we know about that religion?
Well, it was and is a system which has a very tolerant belief system, actually. In fact, Cyrus II was very unusual because he treated his defeated enemies with a lot of respect. He had a lot of religious tolerance. He didn't oblige them to convert. And indeed, a later king, Darius I, he created the impressive Royal Road, which is a network that reached from the Aegean Sea right the way to Iran. It connected 2,400 kilometers of different conquered territory. So they were very much about connecting people and were very tolerant. Not something we associate so much with modern day Iran. How things change.
But this paved road that Reza described, paved, P-A-V-E-D, that means the road was not just earth. It wasn't loose earth that got washed away when it rained. It was a hard road made of concrete and rocks. It was permanent. Unfortunately, this was not a good thing for the Persians, because although it did help to establish and put in place a mail service, a postal service, as well as control over a large territory for the Persians, unfortunately, it also brought down the Persian Empire. Well, why? How did that happen? Well, Alexander the Great from Macedonia, he used these roads, these convenient roads that the Persians had laid, to move his troops and to conquer the Persians, who were financially exhausted from the suppression of people revolting among their states. So the army was weak. Alexander the Great conquered the Persians using the roads that they had built.
Let's shift our attention back to the Americas. Now, we've already mentioned the Mayans, but there were other civilizations in ancient America, North and South and Central. For example, the Incas. Who hasn't heard of them? Everybody's heard of the Incas. They were around from about 1438 AD, so they're more modern, to 1532 AD. So not so long compared to some of the other civilizations, and a lot more modern, although still a pretty long time ago. And their power base is what would be modern day Peru and a little bit into Ecuador and Chile.
And this civilization, the Incas, they grew from a small tribe to being South America's largest empire in the pre-Columbian era. And what did they give us? Well, they gave us the wonderful Machu Picchu, and they also created an extensive network of roads, and some of these roads can still be seen today. What was the capital of this civilization, Reza?
Its capital, still exists today, is the city of Cusco, which was an important center of power and culture for the whole of South America. And their engineers in Cusco and in other parts of the empire, they constructed very sophisticated things such as hydraulics and stone fountains, and they could even bring fresh water from miles away using a system of piping and tubing. And they were also very skilled farmers. They were herders, that means they kept animals in herds and groups, and they were also really good weavers. To weave is to construct cloth or material or clothing by connecting threads together. So they were very good weavers. They also constructed elaborate stone architecture and also created beautiful works of art. But I think you know what I'm going to say, I'm afraid. The Spanish conquistadors arrived and they brought European diseases which were new to the Incas, like the flu, influenza, and smallpox. As well as that, civil war broke out at the same time as the Spanish invasion. And then easily the Spanish could kill off the rest of the Incas using their much superior weaponry. So the Spanish arrival was pretty much the end for the Incas.
Yeah, they went the same way as the Mayans, unfortunately. So now, Omar, we get to the Aztecs. The Aztec civilization from 1325 AD to 1521 AD. And from our research, we couldn't find anywhere that told us where the Aztecs actually came from. That seems to be a bit of a mystery. But they did build their civilization in the south central region of pre-Columbian Mexico. And what did they give us? Well, they gave us, apart from fantastic architecture and art, also agriculture, and they had an excellent military, so they knew how to fight.
So this Central American civilization had a population of around about 6 million, and it was formed out of about 500 city-states, a bit like what the Greeks did. And they developed a very rich and vibrant economy.
What does vibrant mean?
Vibrant means full of life, lively, alive, vibrant. And their capital, let's see if I can pronounce it, forgive me if I don't do it well, was Tenochtitlan, I think.
Sounds good to me.
And it was one of the largest cities in the world at the time. Now, apart from interesting artifacts which they've left behind, we also have some interesting words which are thanks to the Aztecs. Words such as coyote, the animal, chocolate,
Ooh,
in English, chocolate
nice.
in Spanish,
My favourite word.
and another edible thing, avocado, a thing I like, as well as chocolate. I very much am a fan of avocado. And they come from the Nahuatl language, the major, but not the only language of the Aztecs.
So I said they were good soldiers and they had a very strong military. They engaged in frequent warfare. They did fight a lot, and they also practiced human sacrifice as part of their religion. I wonder, Reza, how they chose people for their sacrifices. Do you think they chose lazy people, or maybe thieves or rapists, people who had broken their law perhaps, and they were, or virgins? I don't know. I wonder how they chose people to sacrifice to their gods.
That's a good question. I wonder, maybe they might have had some kind of reverse lottery. Like the winning number gets you death, not a prize, bad luck. Who knows?
I can definitely think of a few people who I'd like to sacrifice these days. Most of them politicians, but we'll leave that for another day. The Aztec civilization collapsed in a similar way to the Incas, unfortunately. The Spanish came in 1517, led by Hernan Cortés, and with the Spanish obviously came the diseases that Reza mentioned, the epidemics, and then obviously battles and death.
So the Aztecs, basically, they were around a lot of the same time as the Incas. They were contemporaries. They were two important empires around at the same time. And unfortunately, the Spanish conquistadors meant the end for both of them at around about the same time.
Yeah. So in view of all these civilizations that we've spoken about, Reza, I think that begs the question. To beg the question means ask the question. That begs the question, what major civilization these days seems to be the most dominant? Or do you think this world that we live in is maybe too globalized to have these kind of civilizations? What do you think?
I think globalization has meant that civilizations are a bit less unique now. There are still some differences. I mean, I'm sure that the typical average day of a Chinese person in 2023 is quite different to a person in Bolivia or in Afghanistan or in Canada. But having said that, most of us are fairly familiar with internet. You could be listening to this podcast in Bolivia, or you could be listening to it in Switzerland. We do have listeners there, or Valencia. So yeah, I think civilizations are a bit less unique now because of globalization. Or what do you think?
I can see two. I can see the American Empire and the Chinese Empire. And the question is, if these empires based on what we've already said in this podcast, don't get along well together and they like to destroy each other. I wonder what's going to happen when the American Empire and the Chinese Empire do decide to fight each other.
That's true. But the thing is, in this day and age, though, one big difference is, as I said, the American Empire and the Chinese Empire is based largely on technology. So with your Apple iPhone technology from California, but assembled in China, can you really separate the two civilizations? These are things that can't be separated. Could Americans have the typical daily life they have if it weren't for all the products in their house that were made in China? That's the interesting thing about the 21st century. Different civilizations depend on each other. The Americans need the Chinese, and the Chinese probably to a certain extent need the Americans as well, whether they like it or not.
I'm sure the Germans thought they needed Russian oil until a few months ago, and now they're opening coal mines. So things change. But let's finish with this question. What will be the next dominant civilization or the next superpower to emerge in the world?
I think for me, you've already answered it. It already is a superpower, but it's going to be the most dominant one, I think, is China. Because I think, this is a bit of a biggie, I'm going to say now. I think the USA...
A bit of a biggie?
A big thing to say. A big one. The USA has passed its peak, in my opinion. It is still the dominant power, but it won't be for much longer. Like all the civilizations we've mentioned, virtually all of them, when was their absolute peak? Nearly always right at the end, or not far from the end. Very close to the end was their peak. They get to the top, the strongest point, when it's not far from the end. So in my opinion, America has passed its peak. Its peak was about 10 years ago, 20. So we're living really historic times. Definitely the Americans were the big boys in town, without any question, 10, 20 years ago. But I think they've passed a peak, which means they still are number one, but they're on the way down, is my opinion. It's a biggie. What do you think?
I'm not sure that the Americans are just going to accept that. I think the next dominant civilization is going to be robots and AI. I think we're going to be taken over by computers and artificial intelligence.
Ooh, that's a really biggie. That's a big thing to say.
That's bigger than yours, mate.
Yeah, that's a big one.
What do you think? What's going to happen to us? Oh my God. Tell us your views. We'd love to hear your voice message. And you can send us a message by going to speakpipe.com, speakpipe.com/Ingles podcast. Emails, Reza?
If you want to write, you could email craig@inglespodcast.com or belfastreza@gmail.com.
This podcast is sponsored in part by mansioningles.com. You can visit the online store and see the courses we have available to buy over there at store.mansioningles.net. And before we go out the door, we'd like to thank all of you who are helping to support this podcast on our Patreon program. And you too can join our wonderful supporters for as little as $1.50 per month, including VAT, and you get instant access to recent transcriptions. For more information, go to patreon.com/Ingles podcast. Details of all this information, as usual, at inglespodcast.com/451. Reza, who are our most recent Patreon supporters?
So those kind sponsors who've joined this month are José Francisco Prieto López, Concha de la Calle, Once Carrascal Simón, César Morales, Rosa Campos, Carlos Enrique, and Benjamin Segura, who very kindly is donating more than the minimum. Thanks to you and indeed all our Patreon sponsors.
Yes, thank you very, very much. Next week, we will be back speaking about vocabulary connected to houses, accommodation, and places where you can live. Until next time, Thank you for listening this week. It's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.
The music in this podcast is by Pitts. The track is called See You Later.